Welcome to Rising Up for Justice, a special weekly series presented by Rising Up with Sonali, an independently produced, subscriber-supported program syndicated to radio stations, free speech TV, and podcast platforms. I'm Sonali Kolhatkar, host and executive producer. Our nation and our world is overrun by billionaires and bigots, but they are few and we are many. On this series, exclusive to subscribers of Rising Up with Sonali and viewers of Free Speech TV, we'll hear from organizers in the movements for social justice, and we'll dig into the nuts and bolts of values, strategies, tactics, narratives, and building power. This week, my guest is Eliel Cruz. He is an award-winning organizer, speaker, and writer, and co-founder of Gender Liberation Movement, an organization working toward bodily autonomy and self-determination for all. Welcome to the program, Eliel.
Thank you for having me. I love the bigots and billionaires line. We are many. I'm going to use
Yes.
that.
And that's the point, I think, for us to cast a focus on social justice organizations that I think a lot of people around the country, think, well, what can I do? And it turns out there's a lot of things people can do. There's a lot of organizations out there, but not everyone's aware that they're out there or have heard of them. So this is our way of profiling groups like yours. Let's talk about Gender Liberation Movement. How do you summarize the work that your organization does? I mean, the title is pretty revealing, but it is broad. What are the main issues that you work on?
Well, the title is broad purposefully so. We are building a lens that's expansive, purposefully, where we can touch on a variety of different issues that gender is a through line for all these issues, whether it be economic justice, climate justice, Palestinian liberation, immigrant justice, reproductive care, gender affirming care, etc. We see our work as a glue between all these various movements. But our work in particular, we do three areas of work. We do direct action and cultural work, media work, and policy work, all responding to these escalating attacks on gender across the spectrum. Our praxis is trans-centered. We don't consider ourselves a trans advocacy organization. My co-founder Raquel Willis is a Black trans activist and writer and media strategist. I'm not trans myself, but I have been in LGBTQ spaces doing work for a very long time as a queer person. So yeah, I mean, our work this past year has been really focused on trans communities, access to reproductive care, gender affirming care, etc.
So I want to hone in a little bit more on this idea of gender liberation and bodily autonomy. As you said, your work is focused on trans folks, but not entirely, because it is a really, really big issue. Trans people are impacted pretty disproportionately, though, right? The attacks by the right, by the Trump supporters, and even, unfortunately, many Democrats has focused on this group that's, relatively speaking, a small group in terms of the percentage of the population, but apparently we're told has a really outsized impact on our lives, which is just kind of bizarre. So I'm wondering if you can outline that threat to trans folks and why it actually is a threat to all of us.
Yeah, so it is an attack on trans people as a whole, but also trans youth in particular have been quite targeted by this administration. Right in the very first week of Trump taking a second term in office, he signed a slew of executive orders, quote unquote, rewriting gender and sex to be binary, threatening federal funding for hospitals and medical providers that provide gender affirming care to folks that are 19 and under. We've seen, the Supreme Court case just did a decision this past June on the Scarametti case in Tennessee, which upheld a ban on gender affirming care in Tennessee and also greenlit other bans in up to 27 different states. So more than half the country have partial or full bans on gender affirming care for young people. The Supreme Court's going to hear another case soon on athletes, on trans athletes' participations. It's supposed to be heard in January and it's going to be decided in the summer. So there's been, like a lot of just like both legislative, executive orders. There's been a lot of bathroom bans as well. So it's kind of coming from all over, right? And the emphasis on trans people is multifold. I think, Trump has been very, and the Republicans as a whole have been very clear that their focus on trans people is a way to rile up their base and win elections. He has said he's going to use the same strategy he did during the presidential election, where they spent tens of, if not hundreds of millions of dollars in anti-trans ads, painting then, presidential nominee Kamala Harris as much more supportive of trans people than she actually is by her votes and her track record, but it really, was a centerfold in their media strategy against Kamala Harris. They plan to do it again during the midterms this year. And as you mentioned, quite quickly, though, Democrats also have not been responsive in the ways that we need them to be to actually fight back against this media narrative. So, slew of attacks, doing it purposefully to rile up their base, have folks focused on that instead of what people actually need, right? The cost of living, unable to afford groceries, rent, etc., the tariffs and the impact on the economy those are having. A slew of different things that people should be focused on, even they're red based, but they want to distract folks from by trying to focus on trans
Right.
people and trans youth. Um, but the reason all of us should be worried about this, right? I think anytime we see a marginalized community, especially when the small is scapegoated, we should all rise up and say this is not okay. We see these attacks on gender affirming healthcare as attacks on healthcare as a whole. Any attacks that happen on your access and ability to access medical care from a provider is wrong and should be worrying for any person, right? Even though I don't need reproductive care or access to abortion, limiting that and banning that and criminalizing that does concern me in criminalizing any kind of healthcare. And really, what I think gender liberation movement is trying to do, right, is while we're supporting and responding to the attacks on trans people, we need cis people to understand how gender impacts their lives as well, and realize that a lot of these attacks, both cultural and political, they're coming from cis people's own anxieties around their own gender, right? Like Republicans and
Mm,
conservatives are, it's their own
that's a good
anxieties about their
point.
own gender that is driving their anti-trans hatred. And if we get even progressives to start thinking about their gender more and start seeing the ways that gender impacts their lives, the way they move through the world, and so on and so forth, I think we'll have a better um, kind of lens in how folks can identify with the attacks that are happening around trans people and also shift this idea that a trans identity is othered and it just may be a different gender experience than your own, but you do have your own gender experience.
Right. And any time there's an attempt by government to impact the way people, impact what people choose to do with their own bodies, bodily autonomy, it can be applied across the board. So an attack on reproductive health is in the same spectrum as the attack on someone to get hormone treatments or a mastectomy or whatever. And of course, cancer survivors need access to mastectomy. So it's that old adage, an attack on, first they came for trans folks and then who are they coming for, right?
Yeah,
Yeah,
and it's also right government interfering with medical professionals who know what they're doing, right?
right.
So these are decisions that are happening with your doctor. In the case for trans youth, it's happening with their parents, therapists, doctors, community. It is not an isolated thing, a decision in and of itself. And yeah, we need to also make the connections in our fight for this healthcare because the folks who are pushing these attacks are the same individuals, right? It's the same legal groups, it's Alliance Defending Freedom, it's the Heritage Foundations, etc., that are pushing the bans on gender affirming care, that are also pushing the abortion bans. And we're seeing there's a ballot measure, I believe it's Missouri, though don't quote me on it, that is being pushed for next year to be added to their ballot that combines the language on the bans for reproductive care and gender affirming care under one ballot measure, which we haven't seen yet before. Um, so that kind of grouping and language and that kind of strategy from the right is very explicit and clear that these are fights are interconnected, and we need to, as progressives, see them as interconnected and work together to rise up against any kind of attacks on healthcare.
Tell me about the four pillars of gender liberation that your organization, Gender Liberation Movement, outlines on your website. What are these four pillars?
So our four pillars are bodily autonomy, self-determination, collectivism, and the pursuit of fulfillment. I think they're big words to essentially say we believe that all people deserve the right to make decisions about their bodies, their futures, and have everything they need to live long, full lives, full with pleasure, joy, etc. So I think we often focus on two of those pillars a lot, the bodily autonomy and self-determination of all, especially post Roe v. Wade and even up to that kind of language is really um, has been mobilizing a lot of folks around those attacks and those fights. But we need to also emphasize collectivism, right? That my ability to get free is interconnected with you, is interconnected with the folks in Palestine, is interconnected with my communities and my neighbors and my fellow human beings. And then there's, I think, that even lesser, pillar or piece is that pursuit of fulfillment, where I'm not working towards a world where folks have to, have the ability and access to for employment and whatever else it is, but they're living to work and they, are kind of just barely making it or making it enough for the families and the folks that they're accountable to. I want people to have joy and pleasure and rest and all these things in their life of too, regardless of how much money they make, regardless of their position in our society. So, um, we wanted to include that to remind folks that we do have these rights to rest, to joy, to pleasure, all these things that should not be seen as luxuries, but as fundamental um, rights for any person who's alive.
How do you go about achieving these goals? How do you go about realizing this world? You threw out a few of the approaches that you use early on in our conversation around the media work that you do, etc., the activism. There's also a march that takes place, and there's one in 2024. Tell us about that.
So our three areas of work is how we're realizing this fight. Direct action and cultural moments, we kind of group those together. My co-founder and I have been working on advocacy campaigns for 6, 7 years, and the formation of our organization, which we're a baby organization, about a year old, came kind of naturally, but we have done a number of large mobilizations. We in 22 Liberation March, an action for Black trans lives, where 20,000 people came out in kind of trying to center the attacks that are happening around Black trans people and state and police violence. We did another really large rally the following year in 2021, centering trans youth, kind of ahead of the attacks that we had be starting to really see ramp up in 2022, 2023, and then last year as well. And in the formation of our organization, we wanted to continue to center direct action. So we did a march in DC last year called the Gender Liberation March, bringing together the fights for reproductive care and gender affirming care together ahead of the presidential election. We also had folks talking about climate action, economic justice, Palestinian liberation, etc., because we see these fights connected. So that was a really important march and kind of mobilizing folks ahead of the election to pay attention to these attacks and really make them, make the connections and between the dots. But we have been doing rallies, marches, and civil disobediences. So we did a bathroom sit-in in Capitol Hill last December, where Representative Nancy Mace wanted to institute a bathroom ban for incoming openly trans Representative Sarah McBride. There was cis and trans women inside the bathroom, cis and trans men outside the bathroom, and 15 of us were arrested um, doing this bathroom sit-in where we said bathroom bigotry has got to go. We did a similar action or another civil disobedience in June in response to the Supreme Court decision to uphold the ban that I mentioned, where 9 of us were arrested doing a blockade in front of the street. And also there was like a ritual where trans people administered their hormones in front of the Supreme Court in defiance of that legislation. So we've been and we did a really large rally in February where 5,000 people came in response to hospitals preemptively ending care in response to the executive orders that I mentioned. So we've been re being really disruptive, which we think is very important in response to these increasingly fascist gender-based attacks. We see disruptive actions around Palestine and around climate a lot in the last few years, but we feel the need that to have that same response when it comes to attacks on trans people and attacks on gender.
And let me
Uh,
ask you about that, because it seems as though, there's been this kind of backlash even among some folks on the sort of liberal end of the spectrum to say that, look, the Democrats focus too much on quote unquote being woke. They focus too much on the rights of transgender people, and look, it's having this bad effect because the Republicans are taking power because of that. And so then the solution is to retreat, to appease the right, to become less visible. You're saying it's the opposite, to become more visible. Explain, let's dig into
I
that a
don't
little bit more, why that's important.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's visibility. I think visibility has its limitations. We have not seen trans people are quite visible, and a lot of the material conditions for trans people have not changed. So it's not visibility. When it comes to the actions, it's about being disruptive and saying these are the lines. We don't allow you to meet. Bathrooms are an inroad to a larger, expansive project to keep trans people from public spaces. They have a long history in our civil rights movements of segregation and of other and anti-Black racism, et cetera, and should be seen as a fundamental right and a line that cannot be crossed. So I think the disruptiveness is necessary to kind of meet the moment and really respond adequately to the level of the attack. Um, and for any progressives and leftists, and when talking specifically about Democrats and their response, which obviously is going to be quite different in terms of how organizers respond, I want to know who are the Democrats that they're talking about when they're saying we're focusing too much on trans people. And or being too pro-trans or pro-woke. Like that's not like if you look at the track records of the majority of Democrats that are in office, that's not the case. They may be responding to the attacks that some-ish, getting caught really more in conversations about the attacks that trans people um that Republicans are pushing, if that makes sense, like on podcasts or whatever, and in response to them being too woke. But in terms of like actions, voting, statements, whatever, like that's not I don't know what Democrats people are talking about. Um, so that's confusing for me in general, but we need more, we actually need them to be pro-world, more pro-world, pro-trans in their actions for us to actually, yeah,
Right.
because we deserve it. And
And I guess
yeah,
it goes
because we,
back to the same thing around protecting the most vulnerable amongst us, because that makes us all stronger and safer.
yeah, it's also just like not something that people should shy away from. Like, so I think a thing that we have been piecing out is that the Republicans are making trans issues all about sports, bathrooms,
Mm.
uh, healthcare, etc. And the healthcare piece is important. But when you ask trans people what are the most pressing issues, it actually is a lot more kitchen table politics, as Democratic strategists like to say, than Democratic strategists are able to communicate. Trans people their needs are housing, healthcare, employment, things that they're fundamental things that every person needs to keep people safe. And that's the message Democrats should be leading with. It's like we're being pulled into these conversations about bathroom sports, et cetera. These are important because they're clearly moves to eliminate trans people from public spaces. But we actually need to redirect on what the priorities are. And the priorities are making sure that trans people have housing, healthcare, et cetera, the same things that every American also are needing. So I think Dems are missing the messaging opportunities and are not learning how to, I wouldn't say pivot away from, but redirect the conversation when they're being kind of like, uh, pulled into these, well, what do you think about the bathrooms or the sports or whatever on these podcasts, etc., because then Republicans are leading the conversation.
Right, they frame the debate
Yeah,
in
they're
this
framing
way.
and they're leading the conversation in this very specific bubble. And instead of like being like,
Right,
actually, let's expand that and here's what's actually we need to know what's actually happening, they're stuck in this like rat wheel, and we need
right.
to get them out of that and have them be not afraid to be able to talk about trans people in this way, unabashedly and proactively.
Yeah, and it's easy to scapegoat people, just as we are seeing being done with immigrants, right? You've brought up Palestine a couple of times, and I'm really curious. I'd love to get your take, or just explain for us why, for gender liberation movement, the issue of Palestine is important. It's, part of the visibility that you have. You mentioned even at the march last year, the Gender Liberation March, there were Palestinian flags being flown. That was an issue. Why?
Yeah, Palestinian flags flown. We had a Palestinian speaker. We had a Jewish speaker. We have a kind of a collective of organizers and activists we work with. A number of them are anti-Zionist Jewish folks who I've been in community with for a long time. Um, we as an organization, yeah, have an anti-Zionist framework and values. We see Israel as an occupying force and as an apartheid state. And we are not afraid to name that. It's not been an issue for us internally and as an organization as we move through our work. And we've been obviously really called to do more and say more over the last few years as the attacks increased and we saw a genocide happening and continuing to unfold. And so our work has included centering Palestinian liberation because of that kind of pressing need for us to make sure that we name this in this moment, a historical moment, do everything we can to get folks in any aspect of our work and our networks to divest and to call for the ceasefire and the liberation of Palestinian people. Um, yeah, I mean we follow legends and elders. Miss Major, a Stonewall veteran who just passed, who is unabashed about her support of calling for a free Palestine, Angela Davis, etc. So yeah, it's not been a second thought for us. We've definitely had people we definitely have issues in terms of how some organizations haven't wanted to collaborate with us because of it. But I would say if you look at our website and see all the different orgs that we partner with, we still partner with a number of national mainstream organizations. We do a lot of work with the ACLU and as well as a lot more smaller grassroots organizations. So we see it as folks that we weren't going to work with that well anyways.
Right. What are the biggest challenges to achieving your goals, and how are you engaging the public? Is this a membership organization? Do you call upon people to support you financially? What's the way in which you're engaging with the public? And I imagine it's a challenge. It's a big country with a lot of challenges right now to all of us.
Yeah, I mean, we're a national org with a presence, more in New York and Washington, D.C., but we're starting to really look at some key states in the South and Midwest as places we're going to be more zeroed in on. Some organizers in Texas, for example, in August called on us and were like, "Hey, there's a bathroom bill that's being heard. We want to do a bathroom sit-in like you guys did. Can you guys help us?" So we went down to Texas and helped them do their first direct action, the bathroom sit-in inspired by ours. I think we're wanting to do more of that, where we support local organizations being more disruptive in their work and ways that we can consult either on their organizing or their media, etc. We do have mass calls where we update folks on GLM stuff and then sometimes have very clear calls to actions, whether it be joining a protest or rally or making calls, whatever it may be, depending on the calls to action. So that's one way folks can get engaged. We're still a baby organization and definitely fundraising, so we're always asking for folks to support us donations, and we've been great. It's been great to have a number of individual donors just kind of come to us and give to us as they see our protest work covered in news and media. We've been working a lot with families and parents of trans youth. We have a monthly meeting with parents and then a separate meeting with young trans people as a way to support them through the changing legal and medical landscape, but also for the parents in particular, be a space for folks to be more politically active. It's not a one-on-one space of like, which a lot of support groups are, and frankly, people do need, where they're like mourning their child and they're figuring how to process it. These parents are not that. They're like, I don't need to be in that space. I'm not sad about my child. I love my child. What can I do? Like things are bad. And they're getting active. I mean, we had a, in 24 hours had people come to the Supreme Court when the decision was handed down and it was a bad decision. We had a parent from Arizona come and speak at our action. We had a dad of a trans kid get arrested with us. Like, and they were like really thrilled of to be included and to even be asked. Like all of our parents are like, we've never been asked to be doing a civil disobedience around this, and I'm glad like you do, because I would want to in the future. And yeah, so we have a number of different ways folks can get
Right.
involved. So those are kind of some of the top ones that I think come up to mind. We believe in doing cultural work that shifts the politics and shifts conversations. So
And how can finally what do you need from progressive minded folks? How can people get involved regardless of where they live? I know that obviously donations you were talking about earlier, you do fundraise among the public because you're a new organization. Is there a mailing list people can join and just stay up to date on how you're doing the work?
sign up for our mailing list at genderlib.org. Follow us on Instagram at genderlib. Those are kind of, our main two communications with the general public. And yeah, that's the easiest way to stay in touch and get involved.
And we'll post a link to that from our website. Eliel, I want to thank you so much for joining us today. Best of luck to you.
Thank you so much.
My guest has been Eliel Cruz, an award-winning organizer, speaker, writer, and co-founder of Gender Liberation Movement, an organization working toward bodily autonomy and self-determination for all. This is Rising Up for Justice, and I'm Sonali Kolhatkar, host and executive producer of this new weekly half-hour series exclusive to viewers of Free Speech TV and subscribers of my long-standing program, Rising Up with Sonali. You can find out more at risingupwithsonali.com.